Hello and welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, where we interview business leaders and emerging market experts on business innovations, market opportunities, and macro-level trends in emerging and frontier market countries. Join us for the next hour to dive deep into the world of emerging markets as we speak with top performers who are successfully investing, working, and living in these markets themselves. Welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Law, and today we are joined by Jan Riehle. Jan is an INSEAD 09D, and he's also the CEO of B4A. After graduating from INSEAD, Jan spent a year working in private equity in Europe, but then moved on to Brazil to manage Springstar, which is a startup incubator there. And then after his time there, he founded Itaro, an aftermarket automotive marketplace, which he sold 4 years later. And then after that, decided to go and form a search fund with his own capital and that of one other investor. And then after searching, he ultimately acquired two beauty brands, Glambox and Men's Markets, which he then merged together into B4A and has now grown the company to over 100 million active users. And that number is probably much higher right now because I got that from some pretty old data. And B4A is now the point where Jan is preparing the company for his IPO. So I was wondering if you could just start out with a brief overview of your pre-search fund life and what it was that initially led you to Brazil and why you ultimately decided to form the search fund there rather than back in Germany.
All right. Before I did my MBA at INSEAD, just to go a little bit further back even, I already had been an entrepreneur in Germany at one point in my life in the internet space. And after that, I worked in M&A in private equity. Right? Then I did INSEAD. At INSEAD, first time I actually learned about the search fund concept. There was a class about it, entrepreneurial potential or something. I forgot the name, but there was a class on this idea of acquiring a company post MBA, and I already kind of liked it back then. After that, I started working in private equity in Switzerland for 1 year. And since I kind of wanted to look at the emerging markets overall, right? And in the beginning, I was a bit open to Latin America or Asia. I jumped on the opportunity to work for a German-Swiss incubator company builder back then called Springstar. And I started working for them in Brazil, taking care of their assets here and mainly working on their exits. Like back then, they sold two companies. And then, basically, we had a bit of good market timing back then, sold at very nice multiples. And I started to think that the market has a lot of potential, right? Which I then started my own things back then in 2011, but not as a search fund at that point, right? I was still new to the market, more like in the startup space. So I started e-commerce companies in the startup space in Brazil, which from my perspective back then was a very young market and highly attractive market at that time. Also at that time, you had a lot of foreign capital wanting to actually own digital assets in Brazil. So it was relatively easy to fundraise back then. And I did that for a couple of years. I had some exits. One company in my portfolio got very big. We made an IPO in 2020 in Brazil with it. And in 2017, another company in the car parts space called Itaro, I think you mentioned it, had an exit to another local distributor. And in 2017, Brazil was not so much in a phase anymore as it was in 2010 and 11. It was not that easy to get liquidity. In fact, a lot of startups in the Brazilian market actually were suffering by not getting liquidity, right? And startups are often, in the beginning, usually not profitable. So kind of you had a lot of distressed assets in the startup space. And that kind of made me to come back to this idea when I was at INSEAD to maybe do a search fund, right? And already in the beginning, I started doing calls with US investors because the whole search fund concept, right? It's back then, at least in 2017, it was more of a US concept. I think it still is, but it was even more one back then. And I kind of started seeing that the way that a search fund usually is structured, focusing more on cash flow positive businesses in a brick and mortar space often is not 100% aligned with what I wanted to do, which was more of basically using the opportunity in Brazil at that time to acquire tech businesses, which were a bit struggling, right? So that's a bit out of the usual scope for a search fund. And you asked me, why didn't you start it in Germany? Already at that time, I was pretty distant from Germany. I worked a huge part of my professional career in Switzerland, then in France, a little bit in Singapore. And then when I came to Brazil, really started to actually develop a very good network of investors in Brazil and also in the market. So for me, like there wasn't even like the consideration of maybe doing this in Germany, right? And again, also I did it because the market at that moment seemed attractive for me for an acquisition in which I would be able to leverage the bad times in the market to get a good pricing. And that was kind of the idea. Yeah, I think that was your question, right? Why did you do it in Brazil and not in Germany?
Right, yeah. Just why Brazil rather than Germany, or why an emerging market over a developed market?
Partly because I was here and partly because I saw the opportunity.
Totally. And you must have really believed in the opportunity, given that you mostly used your own capital from what I know. And not only that, I mean, you didn't follow the traditional search fund strategy of just succeeding some retiring baby boomer. You actually went and bought tech companies that were not profitable at the time and then turned them into profitability. So I was wondering if it was the thesis of technology in Brazil at that time. Was it beauty brands? What about the two companies you chose gave you the confidence that you should be able to buy them and turn them into what you did?
I mean, my search when I started was pretty opportunistic, right? It was a bit sector focused because I wanted something that's close to innovation, something that's close to digital. I before had collected a lot of experience with e-commerce companies in various segments, right? In car parts segment, in jewelry segment. That was kind of a bit close to beauty already. So I had some expertise there. And one of the businesses also had this direct selling aspect, which also B4A kind of has today. So already some experience points in my path on what B4A is doing. And then it came down to opportunities that, again, were around, right? I looked at, I think, around 10 opportunities in the market. And market size kind of also like Brazil at that time was the fourth biggest beauty market in the world after the US and Japan and China. The next biggest one is Brazil and still is today. I think today it's kind of equal with Japan. So may already be the third biggest. So yeah, the opportunity was just huge. There were also not a lot of digital players in this beauty space. Actually, mainly these two and one more, which then got acquired by the biggest beauty brand in Brazil. So that in the end made it happen. And the opportunity arose through network. And I was reaching out at that time, as many search funders do, to all the M&A boutiques that are active in Sao Paulo, asking them if there is something that would make sense for me to look at. And in that search, these two companies, which already were talking about a merger, showed up, right? And that's also how I ended up acquiring both of them because they kind of came as a bundle already.
I see. Makes sense. I think the macro trends in a lot of these emerging markets make the strategy even more exciting than it might be in other places. And I think there is some statistic that says the first time searcher in most countries has a much better return than subsequent searches. So given that they were sort of distressed and they were at a merger stage when you were acquiring them, what vision did you have for the two companies, and how did you come to the point where you realized that you could combine them into B4A and turn them into the ecosystem that you did?
So basically the vision for B4A today is has developed much further than the vision that I had back then. Back then, for me, just to explain you a bit like what these two companies were, right? Like one of them was a beauty box company called Glambox. It's a bit similar to, in the US, to Ipsy or Glossybox or Birchbox, I think was the first player in the space. And basically, I think Birchbox was the first player and they kind of copied Birchbox in the Brazilian market. And they were already, when I acquired them, they were already leaders in the Brazilian market, right? There were a couple of other players, but they were already, I think, like 4 times bigger than the next one. So they were already leader. And they were not profitable, but they had a very interesting cross margin. And I could see the way to profitability relatively quickly, right? So I could kind of see, okay, like restructure them a bit more intense. And in a couple of months, you're going to be breakeven. The other company, Man's Market, was an e-commerce play, multi-brand e-commerce play. And I initially had the B2C vision, which kind of until today in this B2C segment of the business is valid, which was, okay, I'm going to merge them into a shopping club for beauty products. So if you have a subscription, if you pay something every month, you have a lot of perks. And some of the perks are that you are able to also purchase beauty products at better prices, at best prices in the country, right? So that kind of was the idea of combining them. And in this B2C space, right, today B4A, as I said, is much more. Like today we have also a B2B area. So we also attend beauty brands. And we also have an area for influencers. So we have products for digital influencers. But in the B2C space, this is kind of the vision that we realized, right? Today, you purchase one of our various subscription products, which start at a virtual subscription where you pay a low monthly fee and it gives you access to all these perks. And if you go up in the subscriptions, you also get a physical delivery every month to your home, which is customized to the profile.
Yeah, I mean, those definitely make good businesses. Some of the startups that have done really well in the e-commerce space are the subscription-based ones. So that makes sense. I guess your first priority was to get to profitability, and then maybe at that point you could start worrying about
a very interesting aspect of this is recurrent revenue, right? Subscription gives you recurrent revenue, so you don't have to conquer your clients every month from zero. And then if you work on some variables, especially like if you add more value to the package, you decrease churn over time and you start upselling other things. And so you increase your revenue per customer and the number of customers. That was kind of the initial vision. And that's exactly what we managed to do from back then to today.
Sure, totally. I'm sure that was a really exciting process, and it probably took a lot of learning and experimentation, but it looks like it's worked out really well. At what point did you feel that you understood the companies both well enough that you could enact that broader vision? I guess coming in, you hadn't worked in beauty exactly before, you'd been in e-commerce, but then at some point you had that idea that this could be something much larger. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd love to hear where you got those insights.
I think, Nick, the first 6 months, I mean, kind of from the beginning on, it weren't really two companies anymore because I just put them in one office and said, okay, guys, now you're one. Okay, so there was one company from the beginning on. However, there was one company with kind of two cultures, which took a couple of months really to get closer together, right? And to reattribute responsibilities and kind of structure the whole thing. So the first 6 months were kind of that, right? Like to figure out like where are synergies, which functions we can eliminate. I mean, that's an ugly word, but that's kind of what we did. Pretty strong restructuring on the payroll side initially. And that's what I said in the beginning, right? I had very good cross margins, but still not enough revenue to completely cover fixed costs. And that's where we started working on the fixed cost side. So the initial 6 months was bring these two companies together, create kind of a new culture on top of it, and start looking who is adapting to that easily, right? And playing along and starting to buy the new vision and who isn't. And cut payroll and cut also a lot of other fixed costs, cut or renegotiate other fixed costs. And the first 6 months really were extremely intense on this getting costs down side, not so much on like developing growth or anything like that. Like, in fact, I think we kind of lost some revenue, not very much, but we lost little of revenue in the first 6 months. But we managed to get fixed costs like dramatically down. So after 4 months on a monthly base, we actually broke even, right? Which was the idea. And also since we hadn't a lot of capital reserves, like I acquired the company with my own capital and the capital of one investor. And apart from acquiring it, we also put some money on the balance sheet, which we used to get some debt out of the business, right? Like also one reason why it burned a lot of cash was the interest that they had to pay. It was pretty leveraged already at the moment of acquisition. So doing that, taking the debt out and getting payroll mainly and other fixed costs down, we got to break even after 4 months. And after that, after let's say 6 to 8 months, we started working more intense on setting all the levers then for future growth. Then 1 year later, the game was a bit different. I wouldn't say less intense, but it was a bit less emotionally difficult to manage the whole thing, right? After this restructuring phase.
Sure. Makes sense. Yeah. Just intensity, focus on something else, basically. A lot of search fund investors that I've spoken with tell me you should only search in the country you were born in because you'll understand the market and you'll have the connections and all there. I was wondering if there were any difficulties you faced. I mean, coming in and managing someone else's company is hard no matter what. Then if you're merging two together, I'm sure that's difficult. And then I don't know if you grew up speaking Portuguese, but like you're not native language in a different country. I was wondering, were there any major cultural issues you dealt with, or was that not such a big issue when you took over the company and decided to run it?
I mean, for sure that was also a difficulty, I guess. But I tended to all my life be a very optimist person who's usually like, if there are some difficulties being mentioned, always like, it's not really a problem. In retrospect, I mean, it doesn't really maybe help. But then on the other hand, people with our INSEAD background often don't have such a strong national identification, right? Personally, I don't have a very strong national German identification, also because I already worked in other countries before. I had a lot of exposure to other cultures, not only at INSEAD, but also outside of INSEAD. So, I didn't really see that back then as an issue, right? Now, if I reflect on it today, I do definitely have some discipline and like some attributes, right, that usually people probably would attribute to Germans. And I think they kind of are my strength in an economy like the Brazilian ones. Now, if you acquire a company, you need to be a bit careful about, how to put these qualities then inside the newly acquired company if you don't want everybody to run away, right? But on the other hand, if people kind of see that what you are doing is kind of making the whole thing get better, you will also earn some followership, right? So some people you will actually get excited about that, right? And that's the people that you want to keep, the ones that kind of think, hey, wow, that's amazing what this guy is doing. I want to be part of that. And then you give them a bit of equity, and we did that also, right? So I handed out like option grants to key people, and we do that until today, right? So that's part of the incentive scheme at B4. And okay, there are also others who really have a difficulty with that. And yes, it is culturally different from what you find here in the marketplace. But I think today that this difference is kind of what made the whole thing work out, and is more a strength than a weakness, right?
Totally. Yeah, I think that's great that you do that. I think that a lot of people talk about how to create a good company culture, but giving people the opportunity to earn equity, I think that translates across pretty much any country. And that is probably more valuable than anything else you can give people. So can definitely see that would be a good influence on productivity and having the right people in the company. Was wondering if you had any mentors yourself that guided you along the way, or were you just totally doing this based off of your own ideas and vision, or did you have any sort of board or other type of influences that guided you throughout this process?
Yeah, when we acquired the business, I had one investor, right? And this one investor, like I had a history with him. So we already did the deal together in the Brazilian marketplace before that. That also helped a lot to raise the money. And also like we are until today, I would say friends, right? Although a bit distant friends, like he lives on a different continent, not in Brazil. And in the beginning, he was actively involved in a kind of board. So we had a lot of discussions around what we do. So that for me, obviously, was mentorship that was very valuable. When COVID came in 2020, he wanted out, right? And that was also, from his perspective, a bit of a strategic decision to want to divest from Brazil. And I bought him out, right, back then, partly with debt. And from that moment on, I was indeed a bit alone, right? So I didn't really have any mentorship anymore in this endeavor. But at that time, I was already pretty settled also, right? Like the business continued, profitable, was already like way bigger. The COVID year was not easy, I must say, right? Like, because also obviously it made me a bit scared that he wanted out. Also, maybe it wasn't COVID, it was really a strategic decision to restructure. But maybe you remember the year also back then, a lot of VCs in the US, they were like sending around memos to their portfolio companies, like cut all costs, like that's the end of the world and things like that. So I really got scared by that. It turned out that it was extremely helpful for digital and businesses and e-commerce in general, right? Like they all got a huge push by people staying at home. And it was the same for us. So basically we really lifted off in 2020. And in 2021, I started actually raising money in order to expand quicker. And with that, I started not a board, but an advisory board, right? So I kind of gained back some mentorship, which is maybe not so much like technical mentorship, but also network, right? As a German still in Brazil, this is one of my weak points, I would say, right? I'm not within the local business elite. So it's good for me to have some support on that end.
Yeah, definitely network seems to play a large role in success, especially as you get to the higher levels. If you wouldn't mind, I know that you grew quite a bit during COVID and since then as well. If you could share some of the numbers of where you are now, that could be helpful if you're open to it.
Today, we have around 700,000 what we call Glam girls, which are people who are using the app, right? It's like the application that basically gives people a subscription and that actively do purchases in the Glam universe. That's on the consumer front. We have more than 500 beauty brands, all of them in Brazil, which are our clients. So they basically purchase projects in various areas. So it could be like that we give them market intelligence. It could be that we sell influencers to them. It could be that they use our distribution, which we have through beauty products and beauty e-commerce, to send samples to customers. And on the influencer side, we have around a bit more than 7,000 micro-influencers who are using our application in order to participate in these brands' campaigns, and which use our social selling products to sell, like in their own e-commerce shops, products and earn commissions.
Was that part of the company when you joined, or was that an idea that you brought on, was to make it more focused on having that influencer aspect to it?
I mean, also like coming back to your question on numbers, like usually we don't share revenue numbers, but like one thing I can tell you about revenue is that since we acquired the two businesses, we kind of 10x'd it until today, right? So we really grew substantially. And that actually pretty much all the time staying profitable, with an exception like in the COVID phase, because like we kind of grew so strongly then, and then we raised also some money that we didn't need to remain profitable, right? So we kind of accepted to have a negative EBITDA for like maybe 1 year, 1.5 years. And now we are back being profitable, 10 times bigger than at the acquisition. And yes, I mean, initially a lot of focus was on building the B2C vision, which was the subscription and connection of subscription with e-commerce. But then over time, like we built a strong B2B business where basically we have today a team of account executives talking to beauty brands and selling beauty brands products. And we have also a very strong influencer business. It actually may even become a spin-off. Like right now we're thinking about maybe spinning off some of the equity of the influencer business, because it's kind of getting really, really big, and it has its own brand. It's called Bfluence, right? And it's basically like an agency for influencers, just it's focusing more on the micro influencer part, right? You have a lot of agencies around big influencers, but for smaller influencers, usually the negotiation costs don't really make it feasible for a brand to, let's say, hire 50, right? So you can leverage technology to make this process a bit easier for the brand. And that's kind of what we do in this influencer space. Right? What connects everything is that it's all in the beauty space, and it has one overall mission, which is to democratize beauty. And we live that in all these three spaces, right? Like we democratize beauty for the client by making it more accessible to people in Brazil. We do it for influencers, basically by taking very small influencers and giving them support to become bigger influencers, right? And that also has a social aspect and works very well as a motivation and incentivation for the team, because they make people, give them beauty easier. Also, people that come from a poor background in Brazil, they help people who want to become digital influencers, which is kind of the job of tomorrow these days, right? You ask somebody who is 12 years, what do you want to become? And she's like, I want to become an influencer. And so we help these people do that. And in the brand space, we also help indie brands. I mean, we also have all the big brands in Brazil as clients, but we also enable smaller brands to get seen in the marketplace. And often they don't really have many options, right? If they don't have a gigantic marketing budget, an option like B4A for them is very valuable. So we see ourselves as like a hub around democratizing beauty for these three groups.
Amazing. Yeah. I think that a lot of the most successful businesses have that sort of a core principle or guiding why. And then there are different whats that serve the why. And as long as you stay focused on that, you can sort of build a larger ecosystem serving it in a lot of different ways. So it's great that you've been able to do that. And it seems that following that core principle has definitely paid off. I mean, going 10x is pretty incredible after taking the business over. I've heard multiple people calling you a great operator, and by being a great operator, you've had the success. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about what being a good operator means to you and why you think that that's a skill that you have.
Yeah, B4A, I started having like two roles. I was the CEO, right? And I was the COO, which is more the operator position. Today, I'm differentiating these two positions in a way that for me, a CEO is more on the side of strategy, right? I mean, that's usually how the market sees that, right? It's more strategy, vision, communicating this vision right down, and doing a lot of the relationship with the market, outside investors, etc. So that is one role I had from the beginning on, and I have until today. And then the CEO, it's more like really the really busy work of all the time being on top of everything that is going on. being extremely detailist, right? So yeah, kind of, you need to really get your hands dirty. And I think I can do that very well. I did that very well from the beginning on. So I looked in every detail of every area. Usually you don't accept, if you don't understand something, you don't accept, I know, but this is like the guy from there who's doing, and I don't need to understand it. No, you actually try to also go there and also understand it and understand it in detail and try to improve it. Kind of live a bit this example also, right? Because I mean, as you grow and you start having a larger hierarchy, I mean, you're not going to be able to do this everywhere, right? So if you don't give the example, nobody is going to copy you. You have a problem. So kind of need to do that, but then you need to inspire others to do it constantly. You need to rethink all the time efficiencies, communication ways, processes. You can't just say, okay, that's the process. All the time you need to relook it, reconfigure it. A company that grows like B4A is kind of constantly restructuring everything, right? And that needs to be done very actively. Like you cannot just say, oh no, this is good. It's never good. You always need to kind of like go dig into something again. And again, you cannot dig into anything. So you dig into where it's really relevant. And then the other parts to delegate, but to whom to delegate, they ideally follow the same structure. So like, yeah, all these things, right? Like over time, kind of I reflecting, like when I'm thinking about like, so why did this actually work out? I mean, when I look at other CEOs, I often think that they don't go so much in detail about things as I do in many things. So I think that kind of makes me being a good operator, right? Being all over the place, going a lot into details, rethinking processes all the time, never being satisfied with anything is frustrating, but I think it helps, right?
No, I mean, it seems like you've done both well. Not only have you definitely been very process driven, I think you're right that especially if you're taking over a company, you really need to understand every process and every detail. You clearly have done that very well, but you also clearly have the vision and the higher level skills that a CEO typically does. I have been seeing that you've made some posts about AI recently, and you have an AI award at B4A. I was wondering if you just talk a little bit more about why that's an area of focus now and what role is AI playing in B4A's business?
I mean, it's also a very personal interest. Like, I've always been very interested in all future technologies and what's going on there, and also investing personally in technology since I came to Brazil. I started in Brazil. I then also started investing in the US. And I mean, AI is kind of obviously changing everything, right? I think that's not so new anymore. Personally, I think if I compare like my vision, a pretty aggressive vision on what's going on, right? So I think labor is getting completely disrupted, and maybe in 20 years, there won't be any demand for human labor anymore. I mean, okay, maybe, in some markets, certainly quicker, markets in which labor is more expensive. In others, like Brazil, where labor is not so expensive, probably takes more time. But I don't think it's going to take, like lifetimes. I think it's going to go relatively quickly now. And I don't think that many people really realize that. And I think that the phase from now to when this happens still has a lot of opportunity for those individuals who learn pretty quickly to play together with all these, today it's tools, right? They're not yet that independent agents. I mean, they're going to be, but they are not yet. So today you're not going to lose your job because of AI. You lose your job because of somebody who uses AI, right? I mean, that you can kind of start seeing already. So that's kind of like always thinking of my employees, why we are pushing this topic very hard. Like everybody, everywhere, in every area needs to use AI. Who does not use it, it goes in an evaluation. And yeah, I mean, we see efficiency gains, right? In the end, that's also truth. Not in every area, always immediately. Sometimes also you need to kind of push it a couple of months until people get used to using it in an efficient way, because in the beginning they kind of need to have this ramp up phase, right, where they experiment a bit and figure out like what makes more sense, what makes less sense. And mainly initial efficiency boost we got in all the creative functions, kind of, right? Something you can also see everywhere, like where it's about text and image and all the things. But then also it goes into the legal function, like you can analyze contracts much quicker using that. Product development, like we have today for proprietary direct-to-consumer brands, right? So we also develop proprietary products. That's something I didn't say before, but that's also pretty interesting field. And when it goes about analyzing formulas for products, for example, it's really amazing what AI is doing on that end, or what you can do with AI on that end. It really is amazing, right? And it goes on. Like, there are so many areas where I'm talking more about generative AI now, where we kind of use it not as an integrated part of our products, but just as an instrument that we have. So everybody in the team have a paid ChatGPT account. We also have paid Gemini accounts, which then integrate already with the Google Drive that we also use, right? So far, I must say most people here prefer ChatGPT to Gemini, but they're getting better. And on the product side, right, when I talk about like B4A's products, we are now, for example, integrating with an API from Gemini. So customers who are talking to a customer service agent today sometimes talk actually to Gemini, right? So that's also an AI integration. And that we're going to make stronger. Like today, it's a bit more experimental in some cases, which are not so critical, right? But that you can actually increase that. The better you kind of manage to integrate it also with your internal APIs, so that then Gemini triggers things. That gets a bit risky because you don't want to like trigger the wrong thing, right? You don't want a client to cancel something, but maybe he didn't really want to or something like that. So we are learning a lot, but still it's a topic that I'm pushing because it just makes the whole company more efficient. And also, if you think of it long term, I think the opportunity right now in the next 20 years is going to be amazing. And once it's over, there may be no more opportunity for human labor, right? So you kind of, ideally, you use this opportunity now because tomorrow it will be gone.
Yeah, it's definitely the time to try to do what you can with it now. I think it is really incredible. I mean, I would say even now I can do 70 to 80% of most white collar jobs. And I'm sure, 10, 20 years now, who knows where it will go. So definitely a good point. I also like the point that in emerging markets, at least, labor is cheap enough that there may be more opportunity to employ people there for at least some amount of time. So interesting thoughts. I was curious if you have thoughts on how AI may affect those doing the search fund strategy. Like, are there types of businesses you think people should be looking at more now, or ways that they could improve existing businesses with AI?
I think there's huge opportunities also. Like, if I wouldn't be here now doing B4A, I think maybe I would go to the US and do a search fund there. I mean, you told me last time we talked, the US, it's already pretty crowded, right? There are a lot of companies. But honestly, doing a search fund, especially with focus on using AI to get a business more efficient, I think must be an amazing opportunity also in the US, right? Because you have a lot of businesses being run in a very old-fashioned way. And if you get fixed costs down by half, or like you make the existing fixed costs, let's say like this, politically more correct, like so much better that you can double revenues with the same fixed cost. I think that the leverage that you can get through that is really amazing. And I mean, in which industries? I mean, marketing agencies should be pretty interesting, but also like law firm related things, accounting firms. But I honestly don't think there's anywhere like really something where you cannot do anything, right? Like, I think you can use it everywhere. It's just probably you have some industries in which you get more out of it right now, but everything changes also every year, right? So I think like this leverage is just getting bigger now every year. And it's more about the mindset. Like, you need to have a very strong mindset, focus the entire company on it from the beginning on, only hire people who actually already have experience with it and are super open to it. Get rid of people who are, oh no, I don't like that. That's not nice. No, but that's not human creativity, man. That's just like bullshit computer. Like, just ciao, goodbye. You don't need to work with me. I think if you do that, like you get like really efficient, really good organizations, and that is such fun opportunity also, right?
Yeah, I guess part of the thesis has always been that you're modernizing and professionalizing a more traditional business. So I think AI kind of just adds steroids to that and allows you to do that at a much higher level than in the past. Have you had any most surprising insights or ways that AI was helpful in ways that you didn't expect it yet? Or
not so much, but it's also, again, I'm expecting a lot. I mean, I'm extremely optimist on this end, so it didn't really surprise me. I mean, I had some negative surprises, to be honest, right, which is a bit like with what we said before, in emerging markets. Sometimes I wanted to use, for example, in the support functions, LLMs. And turns out, like, often the transactional cost with an LLM is higher than actually like a human operator, because human operators here are so cheap, right? I mean, then also, you need to realize there is a cost curve and it gets cheaper. So if that is the case, tomorrow this is not going to be the case anymore. And in fact, already now we're getting below. It kind of depends on from whom you buy, right? You can buy directly from the source, or you can buy from a layer, an application layer on top. And if you buy from the application layer, then probably it's cost prohibitive. In an emerging market, in the US, probably not even that. So
sure. Yeah.
So even if sometimes you have these kind of figure these things out that here it doesn't really make sense yet, so what, next year it's going to be different for sure, or not than the year after.
Yeah. And I would also say that's an opportunity for US companies, is that people may have been more hesitant to outsource certain tasks, but if the outsourced person is using ChatGPT to give you an answer in native English, it also just enables people around the world also to do similar level work to the ones in the more expensive countries would be doing. So definitely a lot of interesting opportunities out there. Maybe you could just finish with talking about what your long-term goals are for B4A. Where do you see the company going? What would be the ideal outcome for you?
Sure. Right. One thing also, if you want to do a search fund in an emerging market, is that you need to kind of have a very long horizon, because basically in an emerging market, often you don't have the same liquidity that you have in developed markets, right? Like today in B4A, we are at the size where the number of acquirers is already not that big anymore, of potential acquirers, at least national ones. I mean, not saying there are none, but it's already like a limited group, right? So then ideally you have a long-term vision, and I do have a long-term vision. I think a lot of things that we do in this beauty ecosystem, we can actually internationalize. So one way for B4A going forward is to internationalize at one point. And we even think about maybe going to the US, just because the market size and also the degree, especially in this market, in this beauty market, the degree of innovation that we see from here is maybe not as far as we think it could be, right? So we think we could go there at one point. In terms of creating liquidity, maybe at one point somebody comes and acquires us. I mean, I'm not rolling that out, but it's not our primary focus. Like, I think we may do some kind of IPO, don't know yet where the things, like having some conversations right now more local, but also we thought about a SPAC deal, maybe even in the US. That could also be an option at one point. So yeah, I have a very long-term vision. I think that this idea of democratizing beauty has become very strong, and we kind of really make it like concrete, right? By actually really showing it for consumers, for brands, for influencers. And we think we can do a lot more in Latin America and also outside of Latin America in the next, 5 years, 10 years, or even more than that. I think another thing is like you need to have extreme persistence also in an emerging market. I think it's probably in every market, but maybe even more in an emerging market, right? Because things sometimes don't work with the speed they work in the Western world. They take time. Building a business overall is not something that works like extremely quickly. It's just, the cases you hear in the press sometimes. Somebody builds a business, sells it after 1 year. I mean, it exists, but it's not usual. Usually building a business, really creating something that adds value to the world does take time, and probably even more though in the emerging market. And it also is difficult. So if you are not like very resilient and willing to keep it up with that, maybe don't do a search in any market, to be honest.
Yeah. Entrepreneurship is never easy, and in emerging markets, there are a lot of other things you need to deal with as well. So it takes a certain personality to actually succeed at it. And I do think, though, that the benefit of sticking it out for the long term is the emerging markets are where humanity will be in the long term. So if you have that sort of buy and hold long-term strategy, you're not trying to exit quickly.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I don't want to discourage anybody. I think, when I look at search funds, back then, there was almost no search fund in Brazil. Like back then in 2017, I think there was one team, and I kind of met them for a coffee and we exchanged ideas and stuff. I'm not really following so actively, but I think today there are actually like 10 or even more in Brazil. So it developed a lot. And yeah, I think there are opportunities, right? There are opportunities because there are a lot of businesses, and also local businesses and brick and mortar businesses, where people are looking for somebody to take over at one point. So yeah, I think I want to encourage everybody to go this route.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the opportunities are out there. You just got to have the right mindset to do it.
I hope I could inspire some people also in the US who maybe think that there are a lot of opportunities to look at the emerging markets and go a bit outside of the usual market considerations. I think overall entrepreneurship is pretty amazing, pretty interesting. Then it doesn't really matter if you do a search fund or if you do a startup or if you do a mix of them, right? I'm feeling like I'm doing kind of a mix of them, right? Because I acquired, instead of one business, I got two, and then I got some capital into it. It was more like a startup. It doesn't really matter. I mean, entrepreneurship is you're taking a risk and you're doing something new and you innovate. And that's always an amazing experience.
Sure. I think it's one of the best things a person could do. So thanks so much for joining on. It was an absolute pleasure, and wish you best of luck with your amazing company that you run.
Thank you very much, Nick. Great talking to you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.